The last light of summer bent low across the plains, bruised purple and copper, as if the whole sky had been struck. Heat shimmered above the dirt road, but the wind that ran its fingers through the grass carried the promise of a storm. Cicadas sang like rattles in the dusk. Dust lifted from the street of Stillwater and turned silver under the rising moon, spinning in small whirlwinds that made the lamps on the saloon porch flicker. Josephine McGraw kept her chin high as she stepped off the stagecoach platform, though her hands trembled as they clutched the carpet bag. She had been traveling for days, and the grime clung to her skin like another layer of shame. The letter in her bag was creased from being read too often. The letter that had brought her here to a man who had promised a home, a chance to start fresh, maybe even a kind of love. But the man was gone. He had been waiting at the station that morning, all wide shoulders and a stiff jaw. But when he'd seen her, he'd frowned as though the West had sent him a trick. He had taken the measure of her worn boots, her threadbare dress, the way her body was softened by years of living and loss. Then he'd said in a voice as dry as the prairie dust, "I reckon I made a mistake." The words had landed heavier than any punch. She had not begged. She had only nodded, thanked him for his time, and stood there until he walked away. Then she had turned, because she would not let strangers see her face fold in on itself. Now the town watched her like a pack of coyotes circling a limping deer. Women on the mercantile porch whispered behind gloved hands. A ranch hand spat in the dust and grinned as though her humiliation were entertainment. Every step she took down the boardwalk sounded too loud. She should leave. But the East held nothing for her but a widow's room over a tannery and the smell of chemicals that made her eyes burn. She could not go back. If this town wouldn't have her, she would find a way to make herself needed, even if it meant scrubbing floors until her knees bled. She passed the saloon, the piano spilling ragged music into the night. She kept walking until a shadow lurched across the lamplight. He came stumbling out the batwing doors like a man half pulled by the wind. Broad-shouldered, dusty hat tipped low. The saloon keeper called after him, but the man waved him off and staggered toward the hitching post, missing it by a foot. Josephine slowed. Instinct told her to cross the street, but something in the man's gait, the way he paused as if gathering himself, caught her. He was too proud to ask for help. He managed to untie his horse, but swayed so hard he nearly fell. "Sir," Josephine said, before she could think better of it. He turned his head, and the lamplight showed a face carved in lines of sun and sorrow. His eyes were pale and glassy with drink. "You can't ride like that," she said, her voice steady. He gave a low, humorless laugh. "Ain't your concern." His words slurred, but the tone carried the ghost of authority. Josephine glanced at the road leading out of town, dark and empty. A man that drunk would break his neck before the first turn. She stepped forward, catching the horse's reins. "Where's your wagon?" He blinked, confusion flickering. "Down yonder." "You'll tell me where you live," she said, hearing the steel in her own voice, "and I'll see you there." He stared at her, then grunted and gestured vaguely toward the road. She found the wagon, helped him climb aboard, and clucked to the horse. The wheels creaked as they rolled past the last lamplight into open country. The man slumped against the bench, head tipped back. "You ain't from here," he said after a while, his voice rough as gravel. "No, mail order bride," she said. The words hit like thrown stones. "Was." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, so soft she almost didn't hear, he said, "I buried my wife last year. Buried my little girl, too." The night seemed to lean closer around them. He let out a breath that sounded like a sob, strangled halfway. "Ain't been sober a day since." The confession hung in the air, raw and ugly. When they reached the ranch gate, the sky cracked open with lightning. The house was a big frame structure with its windows dark, shutters banging. It had the look of something left behind too long. He half climbed, half fell from the wagon. She leaped down to steady him, and for an instant his weight leaned into her, a man nearly broken. Wyatt Callahan, he muttered, as though giving his name cost him. Josephine, she said. He nodded, then stumbled toward the porch. At the door, he turned back. Stay the night, he said. Storm's coming. Lightning split the sky again. Josephine hesitated only a moment before nodding. She followed him inside. The house smelled of dust and disuse. He dropped into a chair at the kitchen table, head in his hands. She found matches and lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the shadows. She moved quietly through the kitchen, finding a kettle, drawing water from the pump. The storm lashed against the windows, wind howling like the grief in his voice. When she set a cup of tea before him, he looked up, his eyes startlingly clear despite the whiskey. You didn't have to, he said. I know, she answered. Thunder rolled, deep and shaking. He pressed a hand over his face, shoulders trembling. She had been abandoned only that morning. Yet here she was in a stranger's kitchen, keeping watch over a man who had lost everything. Somewhere deep in her chest, something shifted. She did not feel quite so alone. Outside, the rain came down hard enough to wash the dust from the earth. For tonight, there was only this. A woman with nowhere to go, a man nearly drowned in grief, and the storm hammering against the walls as though it meant to break them both open. And for the first time since stepping off the stage, Josephine felt that maybe she had arrived exactly where she was meant to be. Josephine woke to silence and the sharp, clean smell that follows a hard rain. She was in an unfamiliar room, wide-planked and bare. Memory returned. The saloon light, the staggering rancher, the storm. She sat up, her carpet bag still clutched at the foot of the bed. Downstairs, the kitchen was full of pale dawn light. Wyatt Callahan sat at the table, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. His face was shadowed with stubble, but his eyes were clearer. He looked up when she entered. The quiet between them felt almost reverent, as if they were intruding on each other's grief. Coffee is there, he said, his voice low but steady. She poured a cup and sat across from him. He studied her. Reckon you stayed because the road was washed out, he said. Josephine met his gaze. I stayed because you asked me to. Something flickered in his expression. He nodded once, then drained his coffee and stood. I'll drive you back to town once the mud's dried enough. She should have agreed, but the thought of returning to that town, to the whispers and sidelong looks, made her stomach twist. Do you have anyone to keep house for you? Wyatt paused. No. It needs it, she said softly, glancing around. Dust coated the shelves, the curtains hung limp and gray. His jaw worked. You offering? Her fingers tightened around the mug. I need work, and somewhere to sleep. He regarded her for a long moment. Town will talk. They already do. That drew the ghost of a smile from him, a humorless, crooked thing. All right, he said. For now. The rest of the morning passed in quiet industry. Josephine opened windows, shook out rugs, swept dust from corners. Each room told a story. The dining table set for more than one, a child's carved horse on the mantel, a woman's shawl still hanging on a peg by the door, the weight of absence pressed on her like heat. Outside, Wyatt worked the corral, his movements methodical, as though the labor itself was a kind of penance. At midday, he came in from the yard, boots leaving tracks across the clean floor. He stopped short, eyeing the room. Smells different. Clean, Josephine replied, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. Later that afternoon, she walked into town for flour and salt. The gossip started before she had even crossed the threshold of the general store. Mrs. Temperance Blake stood near the counter, her mouth pinched into a permanent frown. Look at her, she hissed to the clerk, loud enough for the whole store to hear. Living out there like some kind of... Josephine kept her head high, though her cheeks burned. She bought what she needed, and walked back down the boardwalk with her spine straight as a rifle barrel. When she returned to the ranch, Wyatt was repairing a gate. He glanced at her face and must have seen the strain. Trouble? Just words, she said tightly. Words can cut, he replied. He knew what it was to be carved open by something that left no visible scar. That night, after supper, Josephine sat on the porch steps. Wyatt joined her after a while, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She was called Anna, he said at last, his voice so quiet she had to lean forward. My wife. Our little girl was Clara. Josephine held her breath. Fever took them both, he went on. I buried them up on the rise. Couldn't stand the house after that. Feels like they're still here, watching me drink myself hollow. The confession settled between them like a stone. Josephine wanted to speak, but found no words. Instead, she reached for the mug he held and set it beside her. Her fingers brushed his. The contact made him turn toward her. You're still here, she said simply. His throat worked as he swallowed. For now. The wind rose suddenly, carrying the smell of wet earth. Wyatt stood, slow and deliberate. You can stay, he said, his voice rough. If you want. There's work enough here. I'd rather see this place put back to rights than watch it rot. Josephine nodded, her heart thudding. She knew what it would cost her. More whispers, more sharp tongues. But the decision felt right, solid as the earth under her feet. When he went inside, she stayed on the steps a while longer. The ranch was quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt watchful, waiting. Somewhere in the darkness, a shutter banged once, then stilled, as if the house itself were holding its breath. By the end of the first week, the house no longer smelled of dust, but of soap and fresh bread. The floors shone faintly in the lamplight, but the air still held a weight, as if the walls remembered everything. A baby's laughter, a woman's song, the silence that followed. Josephine moved quietly through the rooms. She never touched the carved toy horse on the mantel. She dusted around it carefully, as though it were a relic. Wyatt said little, working from first light to dark, mending fences, breaking horses, the grim focus of a man keeping himself from coming apart. It was during a late afternoon thunderstorm that everything shifted. The sky had gone green-black and heavy. Josephine had just lit the lamps when the rain started, coming down hard enough to blur the view of the barn. Wyatt came in from the yard, shirt plastered to him, water running off the brim of his hat. He shut the door and stood for a moment, breathing hard. Sit by the fire, Josephine said. You'll catch your death. He hesitated, then obeyed, lowering himself into the chair by the hearth. She stirred the fire to life, its light painting the walls gold and red. For a while, neither spoke. The storm rattled the windows. At last, Wyatt spoke, his voice low and flat. When Anna got sick, I rode for the doctor. Took me near 3 hours. By the time I got back, the fever had taken hold. Our little girl, she was worse. Doc said there wasn't much to be done. Josephine's hands stilled on her sewing. They both died within a day of each other. His jaw tightened. I buried them. Couldn't bring myself to fill in the last of the dirt. Had to get the ranch hand to do it while I sat on the porch and drank till I passed out. Been drinking most nights since. The words were plain, stripped of defense. They hung between them like smoke. I'm sorry, Josephine said, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. Wyatt gave a short, humorless laugh. Don't need your pity. It isn't pity, she replied softly. It's sorrow, for them, for you. He looked at her then, and for the first time, there was no shield in his eyes, just raw grief, open and unguarded. You said you were a mail-order bride, he said. What happened? He took one look at me and decided I wasn't what he wanted, said I was a mistake, left me standing at the station. Wyatt was silent for a long moment. fool of a man." The words landed like a warm hand on her back. She looked away quickly, blinking hard. The silence that followed was different, warmer. But the town had long memories and sharp tongues. It happened on a bright Saturday. Josephine had nearly finished her errands when a ranch hand called out something crude about Callahan's house guest. Laughter erupted from the saloon porch. Josephine's spine stiffened, but she kept walking. Back at the ranch, Wyatt noticed at once. She tried to shrug it off, but the effort cracked something in her. "They think I'm your kept woman." Wyatt's face went dark. "Who?" "It doesn't matter." But it did matter. That night, he saddled his horse and rode into town. Josephine stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded, her heart hammering. When he returned near midnight, he smelled of whiskey, but was steady in the saddle. He dismounted and came up the steps. "They won't speak your name like that again," he said, his voice low and tight. "What did you do?" Made it plain. Josephine felt the sting of tears. "You didn't have to." "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze. "I did." For a moment they stood there, the air between them charged like the sky before lightning. Wyatt's hand twitched at his side, as though he meant to reach for her, but he turned away abruptly and went inside. Josephine stayed on the porch until the moon climbed high, her heart thudding with something she didn't dare name. One evening near the end of the week, she found Wyatt sitting at the table, staring at the child's toy horse on the mantel. His face was unguarded again. "You ever think the dead stay near?" he asked quietly. Josephine crossed to the mantel and took the toy in her hand. "I hope they do," she said. "Otherwise, we're lonelier than we know." Wyatt's throat worked as he swallowed. He pushed back from the table suddenly. "Come morning," he said roughly. "I'll need your help driving cattle down to the south pasture. Can't do it alone." The words sounded like an invitation and a warning both. Josephine nodded slowly, feeling something catch low in her chest. Not fear, but anticipation. When he left the room, she stood alone for a long moment, listening to the quiet house. Then she blew out the lamp, and the darkness seemed full of unseen presences, watching, waiting. Summer hardened like iron over the prairie. The grass grew brittle and yellow. Each morning brought a sky white with heat. Josephine worked alongside Wyatt, mending fence lines under a punishing sun, driving cattle from one dwindling waterhole to the next. At night she collapsed onto her bed, bones humming with exhaustion, but there was satisfaction in the ache. He no longer smelled of whiskey in the mornings. The bottles she had seen tucked behind the barn were gone. One evening, after a day so hot it left her throat raw, Josephine found him sitting on the porch steps. The light was golden and slow. She sank down beside him, too tired to care that her hair was coming loose. "South pasture's near dry," he said quietly. She nodded. "Saw the cracks myself. We'll move the herd at first light." He turned his head then, really looking at her. There was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten, something deeper than gratitude. The silence between them stretched until it became a living thing. She found herself staring at the curve of his mouth, the faint scar along his jaw. Her heart thudded. For a moment she thought he might close the space between them, but he stood suddenly, as if startled by his own thoughts. "Best get some rest," he said gruffly, retreating into the house. Josephine sat there long after the sky went dark, the almost moment burning in her chest. The next morning, they drove the cattle under a sky that felt too big. When they reached the pasture, the waterhole was nearly gone, just a shallow pool rimmed with mud. Wyatt cursed under his breath. "We'll have to haul water from the well." They worked until their hands blistered, until the sky turned copper and the cicadas screamed. By the time they trudged back to the house, Josephine's legs felt like lead. She sank into a chair and pressed her face into her hands. Wyatt brought her a tin cup of water, crouching beside her. "Drink," he said softly. When she lowered the cup, she found him still there, studying her face. "You're tougher than you look," he said. Josephine almost smiled. "You're softer than you act." That startled a low laugh out of him, rare and quiet. But 2 days later, Mrs. Temperance Blake came riding out to the ranch, her mouth pinched. "Miss McGraw," she said, without preamble, "you are living out here without benefit of marriage. People are talking." "Let them talk," Josephine said. "Decent folk will not stand for it," Temperance snapped. "Decent folk have never stood for much where I'm concerned," Josephine interrupted. Before she could say more, Wyatt stepped onto the porch. His presence seemed to fill the space. "She stays," he said flatly. Temperance stiffened. "You'll bring ruin on your name, Callahan." "Name's already been dragged through worse," he replied. "And she's done more for this place than anyone since Anna died." Temperance turned on her heel and rode away. "She'll tell everyone," Josephine said quietly. "Let her," Wyatt replied. But that night, Josephine lay awake, feeling the sting of judgment. By morning, she had made up her mind. She packed her carpet bag slowly, carefully. She found Wyatt in the barn saddling a horse. When he saw the bag, his face went hard. "You leaving?" Her throat felt thick, but she nodded. "I can't keep being the reason they look at you like that." He stared at her with an intensity that made her want to look away. Then he stepped to the back of the barn, grabbed a dusty bottle from the rafters, and hurled it against the wall. The crash rang sharp, the smell of whiskey filling the air. "I don't give a damn what they think," he said, his voice rough. "You think I want to go back to drinking myself blind? Letting this place rot? You've kept me alive." Josephine's breath caught. Wyatt stepped closer. "Stay. Not because of them, because of this." He gestured around, the barn, the ranch, the life they had been building. Josephine's fingers tightened on the bag. Slowly, she set it down on a bale of hay. "All right," she whispered. The air between them shifted, charged and new. That night, as the sky turned black, lightning flared on the horizon. Josephine stepped onto the porch. Wyatt was already there. "Storm's coming," he said. "Yes," she answered softly. He looked at her, his face lit for an instant by the next flash. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice low, "you stay near me." Josephine's heart thudded once, hard. She nodded, the wind tugging at her braid. When she went to bed, the storm had not yet broken, but the air was charged with electricity. She lay awake, listening, knowing something was coming that would test everything they had built. And despite the fear, she found herself ready. The storm broke in the middle of the night. Josephine woke to wind screaming against the shutters and rain lashing the roof like thrown gravel. The house shuddered. She hurried down the stairs. Wyatt was already at the door, boots half on, a rain slicker in hand. His face was set, grim as carved stone. "Cattle will break the pens if we don't get out there," he shouted over the roar. Josephine nodded and followed him into the night. The wind tore at her hair, plastering her skirts to her legs. The sky was alive with lightning, turning the world silver white, then black. Mud sucked at her boots as she ran with Wyatt toward the fence. The cattle bawled in panic, their bodies heaving against the rails. Wyatt leaped into the corral, shouting to turn the herd. Josephine grabbed a loose rail and heaved it back into place, splinters biting her palms. "Keep them moving!" Wyatt's voice cut through the storm. She waved her arms, shouting, driving the cattle in a tight circle while Wyatt wrestled the gate shut. Lightning struck somewhere close enough to rattle her teeth. They fought the storm together, wordless, until the rain began to slacken. The worst of it passed. Wyatt leaned against the fence, chest heaving, rain streaming down his face. His hat was gone, his hair plastered to his forehead. Josephine stood across from him, soaked to the bone. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Wyatt crossed the distance between them and stopped so close she could feel the heat of him. "You saved half the herd tonight," he said hoarsely. "You saved the other half," she whispered back. Lightning flared again, and this time, he didn't turn away from what burned between them. His hand came up slowly and brushed wet hair from her cheek. "Josie," he said, her name barely more than breath. Her heart hammered so hard she thought he might feel it. "Yes." And then he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss that snatches. It was slow, aching, like a man relearning what it meant to be alive. Josephine's hands came up, clutching the soaked fabric of his shirt. The world seemed to fall away until there was only the two of them, the smell of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "Thought I was done," he murmured. "Thought there wasn't anything left in me worth saving." Josephine swallowed hard, tears mixing with the rain. There's plenty." They stood that way until the wind softened and the first pale edge of dawn crept over the horizon. By sunrise, the storm had left the world rinsed clean. The fields shone wet and gold. They worked together in silence, repairing the damage, their movements easy now, companionable. When they returned to the house, the air inside felt different, lighter, as though the ghosts had shifted, approving. Later, when Josephine went into town for supplies, Wyatt walked beside her. The whispers seemed to die on the air. At the general store, Mrs. Temperance Blake turned to greet them, lips pressed tight. Wyatt met her gaze. "Miss McGraw runs my household," he said, calm but unyielding, "and she'll go on doing so." Temperance blinked, then inclined her head stiffly. "As you wish." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. When they reached the house, Wyatt dismounted first and offered Josephine his hand. She took it. Inside, the kitchen smelled of fresh bread. Wyatt stood for a long moment, just looking at her. "I can't promise I won't falter," he said finally, his voice low. "But I can promise I won't let go again. Not of this place. Not of you." Josephine felt the truth of it settle in her chest like a sunrise. "Then we'll make it stand," she said. Wyatt smiled, a rare, quiet thing, and reached for her hand. That night, as the sky turned soft with stars, Josephine sat on the porch steps. The world was still battered from the storm, but it was alive. Wyatt came out and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. She turned her face toward the dark horizon and spoke as though to someone unseen. "You were right to leave me standing at that station," she said softly, not to Wyatt, but to the ghost of the man who had rejected her. "If you hadn't, I never would have found my way here." Wyatt's fingers closed gently over hers. She looked toward the east, where the moon was rising, painting the fields in silver. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, the sight of the future didn't frighten her. Sometimes life brings you to your knees, she thought, just to show you the ground you were meant to stand on. If you enjoyed this story of two broken people finding a way to build a new life, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Let us know in the comments if you've ever found strength in an unexpected place.